Hello friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we're learning the system of Reiki to be rooted, to be spacious, to be connected, and to remember ourselves. My name is Michaela, welcome back to the studio. This video is part 2 of an Ask Me Anything video series, responding to a question posed by my Reiki teaching apprentice about resources for learning and practicing Reiki. As anybody who takes on a practice knows, the resources that we use, the books, the videos, the other equipment that helps us to learn these systems are incredibly important. And for a former academic and lifelong learner such as myself, this was just the question to send me scrambling to my bookshelves and ransacking them for all of my favorites. So I put together a collection of books and resources that I turn to regularly in my Reiki practice, both as a teacher and in my personal practice. And so I wanted to continue sharing those with you. In our last video, we worked with books and resources specific to the system of Reiki taught from its Japanese origins. That was a substantial enough pile in and of itself to break this into 2 videos. And so today we're going to be working with books and resources about that give more of the cultural and historic contexts around the foundations of the system of Reiki, but that are not explicitly about Reiki. So those are books focused on Esoteric Buddhism, on Shinto, on Japanese history and culture generally. Then we're going to look at books that are really essential to me as a teacher and as a practitioner, that are inspiring, that are instructive, but not explicitly about Reiki. And then we're going to look at some books that are specific to my work with trauma-informed Reiki. So the books that I use to put together that class and to put together the manual that I wrote for it, and that really helped to kind of bridge those worlds together. So let's dive into it. All right, so the first book that we're going to look at is this one here, The Essence of Shinto, Japan's Spiritual Heart by Motohisa Yamakage. This book is probably the most accessible to a Western-minded person about the practice of Shinto that I have come across. Shinto is the indigenous spiritual practice within Japan. It's been present as long as there have been the Japanese people. It's deeply ingrained in the mindsets, in the day-to-day life, in the spirituality, of course, of the Japanese people. And as something as ancient and as deeply ingrained as Shinto is, it can be very difficult to explain it in a systemic way to an outsider. And so I was really grateful to find this book because of the way that it breaks down the spiritual, historical perspectives of Shinto and really, systematizes it in a way that is understandable to my mind, focusing on, the philosophy, but also the practice of Shinto as a tradition. So super valuable book. I've built a couple of classes around some of the core concepts in this book and other resources, particularly around the nature-based emphasis of Shinto. It's a place where we can all enter into from a certain perspective, because all of us, if we go far enough back in our lineage, come from people who had some form of nature-based spirituality, some form of religion or spiritual practice that was rooted in our experience of the natural world and our attempts to understand the many magical phenomenon that we can observe in the natural world. And so Shinto and the perspectives that come from this practice are ones that can feel very familiar from a certain perspective to many of us, and at the same time be very particular to the time and place from which it came. So highly recommend The Essence of Shinto as an entry point into this work. On the other side of that, Esoteric Buddhism is an incredibly important foundational aspect of the system of Reiki, and there's many more resources available for learning about Esoteric Buddhism, I would say, than about Shinto. which is lucky. There are, of course, many different forms of Buddhism. So when we're talking about Reiki, we're talking most specifically about Shingon Buddhism and Tendai Buddhism, which are the first uniquely Japanese forms of Buddhist practice. There are, again, many resources for learning about and working within those systems. The ones that I use are not, I wouldn't even say the best. They're just the ones that have come to me and that, work well for me. So the first are actually online resources that come through two Shingon temples that are relatively local to me. By local, I mean in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm in Central California, and there are some really amazing live classes and live cultural experiences and rituals that are regularly offered through the Shingon Temple in Seattle, the Seattle Koyasan Temple, and in the temple in Portland, the Henjoji Shingon Temple in Portland. So both of those temples offer classes. So in Portland, they offer an intro to Shingon class and regular Dharma talks with their pastor, Reverend Kosho, and really, really excellent introduction to Shingon classes. Just very comprehensive. Reverend Kosho is a historian at heart. He is an academic at heart, incredibly learned, incredibly knowledgeable about Shingon, about Buddhism generally, but in particular about Shingon, and also very skilled in putting it in terms that can be understood by people who are new to it. So as an introduction class, it's both comprehensive and also accessible. And then his Dharma talks go into more specificity, more depth, more kind of speciality around particular texts and practices within Shingon. I often step into those Dharma talks kind of as an immersive experience, not necessarily seeking to really understand and fully grasp everything that he's teaching to, but to be immersed in the teachings itself. I find them very valuable. Through the Seattle Koyasan Temple, on the other side of things, so we have kind of learning and education, and then we have practice. And so the Seattle Koyasan Temple offers a wide range of regular weekly and monthly practice sessions in a variety of forms. They offer an Ajikan moon meditation, an Ah mantra meditation. They offer Sunday services. So if you want to see what a full Shingon Buddhist service looks like, every Sunday they put those on live on the internet. And then a monthly Goma fire ceremony, which is an incredibly dynamic and amazing experience. If you can catch one live, please do. It's amazing. But in lieu of that, they are shared on through the Seattle Koyasan Temple as a live broadcast. So those, I'll put those links down below to how to find out about those classes. Highly recommend them. For a deep dive into a particular aspect of Buddhism, but Shingon in particular, that is incredibly important, I'm going to recommend Mushotoku Mind. This is The Heart of the Heart Sutra by Taizen Deshimaru. And the Heart Sutra is a essential text within Shingon. It is foundational, but it's also a higher level of study for many of us. It is an incredibly powerful mantra to work with, and it's incredibly powerful as a sutra for study. And so Mushotoku Mind really goes in depth into how to understand the Heart Sutra. This is actually primarily from a Zen perspective, Zen being essentially the third specifically Japanese form of Buddhism that was developed after Shingon and Tendai. It has its particularities, its specialities. They're not identical practices, obviously, but of course they are very well related. So super valuable perspective from this book, doing a deep dive into the Heart Sutra. We've offered 21-day practices here at Heartscapes with the Heart Sutra, where we spent 21 days chanting the full sutra, learning a little bit about its perspectives, just the barest, shallowest of dives into the incredible depth of this piece of practice. And hopefully we'll be offering them again. This is a fantastic resource if you are interested in following that study. Also related to Shingon Buddhism or Esoteric Buddhism of Japan generally, I wanted to share a little bit of a different type of resource. This is an oracle card deck that is specifically focused on the Esoteric Buddhism of Japan. And this resource was actually shared by my teaching apprentice, one that she uses to just help as also on the one hand, a quick reference guide for the many deities that show up in Esoteric Buddhism, and also as an oracle deck, as a form of intuitive divination that is specific to this tradition. The artwork by Miki Okuda is absolutely gorgeous, just beautiful. Just absolutely a gorgeous deck. And then the accompanying book gives you, as is often the case with an oracle deck, gives you a little bit of a description of each of the deities on the cards, offers, a blessing and a piece of advice from that deity, and then a little bit of a deeper dive into how to interpret that. So really useful device, both for just kind of quick reference for some, not all, but some of the many deities within Esoteric Buddhism from Japan, and a really nice oracle deck if you are inclined to use the oracular arts, which I sometimes do. All right. So circling back to Zen again, I want to share these two resources. These are both written by Zenju or Flynn Manuel. She is a Zen priestess who is she's based in California. She's been based in various temples, so I'm not sure where she's currently practicing. But her work is really powerful and valuable, very applicable to our life. Application of Zen to modern life. This is a picture of our author here, Zenju or Flynn Manuel, and she really has this powerful way of applying the incredibly esoteric perspectives of Zen in a very practical way in our daily life. So these two books explore two very specific things that are of great interest to me. The first is the shamanic bones of Zen. And this is really exploring, well, as it says, the shamanic essence of Zen, which includes connections to Shinto, but also other roots of the system, and compares it to shamanic bones of other systems of practice that are in her traditions, that are in her lineage. Really fascinating exploration. And then this one was just published, just came out, Opening to Darkness. This is 8 gateways for being with the absence of light in unsettling times. So really gathering up what we've learned in the shamanic bones of Zen and applying that in some very powerful, very direct ways in our modern times, working with shadow, working with darkness, and approaching that not as a negative aspect of life, but as an essential aspect of life, a fertile space, and how to be with the darkness in ourselves and in the world in a way that is powerful and that benefits us. So really, really powerful reading. Highly recommend it. And then lastly, in this category, there are four essential aspects of the foundations of the system of Reiki. 2 we've already discussed, Shinto and Esoteric Buddhism. A third is Shugendo, which is essentially a derivative of those 2. It's mountain shamanism, which blends together those traditions with other shamanic practices within Japan, very related to Shinto and Esoteric Buddhism. The fourth is the martial arts, specifically the precursors to Aikido, and that comes through the samurai traditions that Mikao Usui had in his family lineage. So Mikao Usui, the founder of the system of Reiki, came from a family of samurai, and in his early youth, around 12 years old, the samurai were outlawed in Japan as part of the Meiji Restoration. But the spiritually oriented martial arts practices that were already part of his life at that time were still essential to him, and they found their way into the system of Reiki. And so this book, this is one of many that is valuable in this realm, but this is definitely one that I recommend. Aikido, Words of Power, The Sacred Sounds of Kotodama by William Gleason. And so this really works with the spirituality of Aikido and the internal energy system that is operational inside of the system of Aikido, and with emphasis on Kotodama, which is the practice of sacred words, of words that carry spirit, of words that carry an energy, and not just words, but seed sounds that carry essential energy and power. If we think of the word Om within the Indian Vedic traditions, that's the seed syllable that's said to have created the world, right? Many traditions have this concept of the sacred sound that has the power of creation, the power of destruction, the power of wisdom, and in practices and traditions that have a deep emphasis on mantra, on chanting, then words like this, sounds like this are essential, and that absolutely applies to Japanese spiritual practice. And so this is an exploration of the spirituality of Aikido through the lens of Kotodama. And oftentimes in reading through this, you could easily substitute the word Reiki for the word Aikido in the ways that it's describing these principles and practices, and they would still mean the same. So it really helps to understand, it helps to flesh out the understanding of Reiki through the lens of the physical practice, of the physical spiritual practice of Aikido. All right, so that completes that section. And we're going to move on to 4 books that are not explicitly about the system of Reiki and not explicitly about Japanese spiritual tradition, that actually show up in different traditions, but that nevertheless carry some really important, essential messages, practices, perspectives that I find enrich my Reiki practice greatly. These are books that I reach for again and again, that have not only shaped my Reiki practice, but really my worldview, my orientation to life, you could say, have been deeply influenced by these books, and I'm excited to share them with you. So there's 4 of them here. There are many other books that have had this impact on my life, but these are the ones that I use most explicitly in my teaching with Reiki. So the first and probably most influential of these for me is the Book of Joy. The Book of Joy is a powerful and incredibly useful and pragmatic resource that walks us through a systemic way of thinking about and practicing systems that enhance the experience of joy in our life. It is basically narrating a week-long conversation between the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So the person representing Tibetan Buddhism right now in the world, and a person representing Christianity that has been incredibly influential in the world. Unfortunately, we lost Archbishop Desmond Tutu in this physical frame about a year and a half ago. So I'm really grateful to have his teachings in many forms, including the Book of Joy. And so in this book, from their perspectives as 2 of the most respected and esteemed and beautifully compassionate spiritual leaders of our time, they really present the idea that the purpose of life is joy, and that joy is our birthright, that it's essential to us, it's deep inside of us, and it's accessible to us even when we are in difficult times, but that we need to train ourselves to access that joy because it can so easily be buried over by fear, by despair, by anger, by jealousy, by all of the things. And so it walks us through 8 obstacles that are commonly in our life that are obstacles to joy, and 8 pillars of joy, the things that we can intentionally cultivate in our life in order to experience access to joy as a way of life, rather than as a fleeting experience that is dependent on outside circumstances. And just real briefly, I just want to name the 8 pillars of joy so you can kind of get a sense for where we're going with this. So in order, they are perspective, humility, humor, acceptance, forgiveness, gratitude, compassion, and generosity. I just actually completed a 9-week class walking through the Book of Joy. We took each of those 8 obstacles and pillars and really did a deep dive with them as concepts in our life and also as practices. It was a really powerful experience. I will be offering that class again at some point, possibly next spring. So you can keep an eye out for that. It's an incredibly powerful and practical resource that, I'm going to go ahead and say it, is life-changing if you really work with it. So the Book of Joy. Related to the Book of Joy, actually the precursor to the Book of Joy, before we had the Book of Joy, we had the Book of Forgiving. And this is by the Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mfo Tutu. And this is an incredibly valuable resource. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, if you don't know anything about his life and about his work, I really recommend that you look it up, that you learn a little bit about him. So he was the spiritual leader of South Africa during the end of apartheid and was really instrumental in supporting the deconstruction of that system as a political and social system, and in the election of the first democratically elected Black African president of South Africa in Nelson Mandela. And in that role, Desmond Tutu oversaw what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was a very intentional and radical attempt, successful attempt, at making this transition from an incredibly oppressive and racist social and political structure wherein a white minority had brutally oppressed the Black African majority of South Africa for decades and decades and decades. Just brutal oppression. An effort to make this transition to a democratic society where, in theory, there were equal rights of the races, and to make that transition without violence, without widespread violence. The whole world predicted that South Africa would descend into civil war at this time. And it did not. And it did not in large part because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And this was a practice of bringing justice for wrongs done. So it was a legal proceeding, but it was also a restorative justice proceeding. It was the precursor to the field that is now known as restorative justice. And it was saying that what matters here is not just that wrongs are punished, but that reconciliation, wherever possible, happens among the peoples of this nation. It was said to be impossible. It was incredibly difficult. It was incredibly painful. But it went through this process of storytelling, of people telling the truth of their experience on both sides. So the people who were on trial for war crimes, essentially, that had been committed against the Black South African people, and the people who had been the victims of those crimes, each side telling their stories of what had happened and coming to resolution that was legal justice, right, where wrongs were held to account, but also reconciliation in the hearts of the people. Obviously, you can tell I'm passionate about this subject, so I'm not going to go down that path any further. But out of that experience came a body of work about forgiveness. Archbishop Desmond Tutu became the foremost authority on forgiveness, because that was an essential component of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was forgiveness. And so with his daughter Mfo, they took the essential learnings from that experience and put that into a, again, very practical, very accessible system of practice for any of us, you, me, to go through a process of forgiveness in our daily life. It's really beautiful the way that both of these books, both the Book of Joy and the Book of Forgiving, use these really big global examples of really intense experiences, but then make that accessible, to us in our daily life, whatever it is that we might be struggling with to forgive about ourselves, right? Self-forgiveness or forgiveness with others. It puts in our hands a practical, valuable, effective, and deeply spiritual process for coming to forgiveness in our own heart. First and foremost, because of the freedom that affords us when we release unforgiveness, right? So very, very powerful resource. I have used it myself to walk through my own processes of forgiveness, and we use it in our teachings around this topic. You want it in your life, grab it. Okay, so moving on to this beauty right here. This is The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, The Power of Radical Self-Love. I am really grateful to count Sonia Renee Taylor as a colleague. We worked together years ago when I ran social justice leadership programs in Mills College in Oakland. And Sonia Renee Taylor was one of the most inspirational people I got to work with in that role. And her work with radical self-love is an incredibly powerful, spiritual, and emotionally healing-based perspective on social justice work. It really takes the perspective that injustices, in particular racism, transphobia, misogyny, these like big entrenched systemic injustices, these systems that cause deep and lasting harm to people, to individuals and communities, are rooted in what she calls body terrorism, in the making wrong, the making in many cases illegal of particular bodies, of saying that particular bodies are good and right and other bodies are bad and wrong. And that when we look at the practical and like lived experiences of what it means to experience racism, to experience misogyny, to experience transphobia, what does that actually mean? It means crimes against our bodies, crimes against our mental bodies, our emotional bodies, our physical bodies. And that makes us, it breeds a lot of things, but among that, a culture of shame about who a person is with regard to the parts of themselves that are singled out by those types of systems. And to that, Sonia Renee Taylor says, the body is not an apology. We do not need to apologize for the bodies that we were born into, that we deserve and are, that we deserve and should be afforded respect and kindness and love around those bodies. And so she's built a really powerful system of work around the concept of radical self-love and what that means. This book encapsulates it really well. As you can see, it's a relatively small book. It's pretty accessible. It's easy to go through, filled with really powerful, but again, accessible concepts and then also practices. You'll notice that as a theme in many of the books I'm recommending here. Concept and then practice. How do we put it into our life? So very easily to apply to our life practices offered in this book around the concept of radical self-love. And I find that these concepts marry absolutely beautifully with the system of Reiki, which is so much about remembering our wholeness, remembering that we are inherently whole, that we are inherently good, that we are inherently healed, and that it is the distractions of life around us, which includes oppressive systems, that shield us from remembering that. And so the practices that she offers here in this book absolutely support us in remembering the wholeness of our true self, which is how the system of Reiki defines healing. Beautiful, beautiful book with an absolutely stunning cover. I mean, look at this. Sonia is just a goddess. The last book in this category, and again, this was a category I could have spent another hour pulling books off my shelf. I really had to like rein in. I could have pulled lots and lots of other books off the shelf, but I really did want to make this not a ridiculously long video. But the last one in this category I want to highlight is The Art of Holding Space by Heather Plett, a practice of love, liberation, and leadership. Heather Plett has really popularized and done quite a bit of in-depth work around the concept of holding space. What does it mean to hold space for someone, to hold space for ourselves, for a situation, for a difficulty? It's a concept that is present in a lot of spiritual practice, a lot of therapeutic practice, but had not been so well articulated and fleshed out before Heather Plett's work. And this book is a really beautiful encapsulation of that work, of what it means to practice love, liberation, and leadership in the context of holding space for ourselves and for others. Again, marries absolutely beautifully with the system of Reiki. And, isn't about the system of Reiki, but absolutely informs our practice with the system of Reiki in some really beautiful and practical, applicable to life kinds of ways. The Art of Holding Space by Heather Plett. Okay. We have got just 2 more sections here. I'm going to turn now to books that help to inform my work with cultivating a trauma-informed Reiki perspective. So I offer a class usually twice a year, and I have a written book, which maybe one day will be in this pile of books. Right now, it's the manual to the class, directed at Reiki practitioners who want to bring a greater sense of safety, of trust, offering opportunities for consent and for choice into their Reiki sessions with the perspective of being trauma-informed. What that means and what are the mindsets and practices that we need to cultivate in order to offer that to our clients and our students. And so I built that body of work because there is a lot of really amazing work in this realm being done in the areas of yoga, of mindfulness meditation, of course, in therapy and psychology settings, but there had not been anything done specifically for Reiki practitioners. And while there is a lot of overlap with those other fields, there were some things that were particular to Reiki that I wanted to emphasize. So I wanted to just share some of the resources that I used to create this body of work. The first is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This has become really, kind of like the essential textbook of understanding our, current scientific understanding of trauma. The subtext here is brain, mind, and body and the healing of trauma. So really in-depth, but again, accessible, easy to understand. This is written from a clinician's perspective, but it's still very accessible to a lay practitioner who is not a trained psychologist by any means. Really going through the physiology of trauma, what it means to be traumatized, to carry trauma in our bodies, and methodologies for unlearning that trauma. And one of the things that became very clear in his research, which began working with World War II vets and Vietnam War vets decades ago and continues to this day, one of the things that really became clear to these researchers is the importance of embodiment-based practices in the healing of trauma. That talk therapy can only get us so far when we have the physiological impacts of trauma stuck in our bodies. Stuck is an inelegant word for it. It's not exactly the right terminology, but it'll do for now. So really important for just understanding trauma from our current understanding of it from a scientific perspective, and how to think about it in terms of a practitioner's perspective. 2 other resources. One is primarily an online resource, although I think she has just recently published a book that I don't yet have to show you. But Zabi Yamasaki is a really powerful and well-known teacher of trauma-informed yoga. And, trauma-informed yoga was really the field that this kind of work with trauma in a psychology setting started to filter over into the world of embodiment-based practices. So the world of yoga has gotten pretty far in incorporating these perspectives, and it's been very instructive to me. And Zabi Yamasaki is a really powerful teacher inside of this realm. So I took a couple of her courses online in my studies with this, and as I said, I believe she just published a book and a card deck around these practices. The card deck in particular, and I believe also the book, are directed at survivors of trauma, of violence, and it's to be used as a healing tool. her classes are largely directed at yoga teachers in how to incorporate a trauma-informed lens into their teaching. And so that was deeply informative and helpful in my work. I'll put her links down below. The other really essential resource was the book Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Treleaven. I do not have it here in my pile. I was revising my materials for my class and have that book off my shelf somewhere. I don't know where it is, but maybe I'll put an image of it here, or at the very least, I'll put the link down below. We'll see how in-depth I get with my editing before I need to put this video up. But Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Treleaven. So he's colleagues with Zabi Saki quite a bit. And his book is, as the title implies, directed at mindfulness meditation practitioners. And this was incredibly valuable to me because it was more analogous to Reiki. So the teachings that he offered for mindfulness practitioners were more closely related to how we might use these things in a Reiki perspective than the yoga work. So really, again, informative in terms of the theory and directly applicable to practice. Incredibly valuable book by David Treleaven. All of these books are going to be in a bibliography list down below so that you can check them out. One that I've been using for a really long time before I was working with Reiki, actually. I think I was working with this book called Gestures of the Heart by Pamela Church. This is an older book. It was published, not sure when exactly, but it's been out for quite some time. And it was really based in some of the 2007, some of the earlier research into trauma and the embodiment-based practice that can be so supportive in trauma healing. And so it's a series of essentially recipes, like it's using certain gestures, such as this gesture of holding the front and back of the head, which is actually one of the foundational hand placements in hand healing in the system of Reiki. Various different gestures, hand holds, movements, simple positions of the body that impact our emotional state in specific ways. She describes those individual gestures and then mixes them together in recipes to address a wide range of emotional challenges that a person might experience. I find them to be very effective, very easily integrated into Reiki practice, and just a really helpful book using, again, research that is older at this point. So there's been a lot of development in the research that's gone into this book since then, but still a very useful, applicable, current type of work that is really well integrated into Reiki practice. So those were the three I wanted to highlight, or three or four that I wanted to highlight in that section. And the last category I wanted to name, I'm not going to go through all of these because honestly, it's just a huge stack. And it's also a category that can be very personal, very specific to each of us. So I want to just more highlight the category with a couple of examples, then kind of go through a deep dive of this whole stack. And that's the category of poetry, song, and stories. In my teaching of Reiki and anything else that I'm going to teach, I will often bring in poetry, song, and story as a way to activate our imagination, to activate those, hidden places of our subconscious, to activate our attraction to beauty as both a teaching tool and a healing tool. It's an incredibly powerful element, sacred tool to bring into our teaching and our practice, whether it's our personal practice or something that we're sharing with other people, to use poetry. And poetry, song, story, these again are very individual. We're going to be attracted to the poets and the storytellers and the artists that speak to our soul and that reflect our worldview, our values, our perspectives, and our sensibilities when it comes to what we find beautiful. And so just three that I'm going to highlight from this really quite massive pile over here. One is very connected to Reiki, and this is this book of haiku poetry by the most famous haiku poet in Japan from several hundred years ago, Basho. So it's just a really lovely series of haiku that he composed on a particular journey. The Narrow Road to the Deep North and Other Travel Sketches by Basho. Just really delightful little nature-based observations that are incredibly useful inside of a meditation practice, and also connected to the tradition of waka poetry that was very much alive in Mikao Usui's time, several hundred years after Basho's time. But also waka poetry was used very explicitly within the original form of the system of Reiki by its founder, Mikao Usui. So using these haiku helps to bring that aspect in. Probably the ones that I use the most are from this series of books, Prayers of Honoring by Pixie Lighthorse. I'm actually a distributor of these books, and I'm out of the other 3 in this series, so I only have these 2 to show you. But Prayers of Honoring by Pixie Lighthorse. This one is Prayers of Honoring Grief. There's also Prayers of Honoring Voice, and then one called Boundaries and Protection, and one called Gold Mining the Shadows. Just beautiful poem prayers that are aligned with the seasons, that are aligned with conditions of our heart. Incredibly inspiring, very nature-based. Pixie Lighthorse is of American Indigenous origin and writes from that perspective, and also very justice-oriented in her perspective, and that comes through in many of her writings. So I often use her prayers to open and close classes. And then last, but certainly not least, I have just got to uplift Fables and Spells by Adrienne Marie Brown. This book just came out. It's absolutely delightful. It's a collection of poems and short fiction by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a really important voice right now in the intersection of spirituality, of art, and of social justice work, racial justice work, gender justice work. Just a really powerful, powerful teacher and artist. This book, Fables and Spells, again, is a collection of short stories and poems. And so I use it in this inspirational way. She also has a podcast with her sister called Surviving the Apocalypse. Really, really delightful podcast, ongoing conversations between them and with special guests. And then she does a lot of deep dive work around emergent strategies, around activism, and around the combination of activism and art. So definitely a creator that you want to check out, an inspiration of witchy goodness in my life and in the life of many others. Ooh, friends, that was a long list. I think between the 2 videos, we're well over an hour. If you have even stuck with me this long, then you're my people. You are my nerdy people. You want to just sit down with a stack of books, and I love it. I'm here for it. I hope that there has been something on this list of resources that touches you, that you feel excited to dive into. There's going to be links for all of them down below. If you have a question that you would like answered about the system of Reiki or anything else that you've heard me talk about, please share it below. I'd love to address it in a future video. And as you move into your day, well-resourced with many, many books and your own questions and ideas, may you be deeply provisioned. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time, I love you. Goodbye.